The Chinese are very, very unhappy about this Ukraine war. If they had a choice, they would rather that Putin didn't start this invasion of Ukraine because it's in the long-term strategic interest of China to see Europe emerge as an independent political whole that China can deal with as an autonomous geopolitical actor. As a result of the Ukraine war, the Europeans have become far more dependent on Americans for their protection, certainly against Russia, and they have become, in some ways, geopolitically compliant to American wishes. And if you want proof of this, just take a look at the case of Italy. Italy was the only G7 country that was brave enough to have an independent foreign policy and join the Belt and Road Initiative. Today, the Italian government is under so much pressure from Washington, D.C. that it feels that it has to withdraw from the Belt and Road Initiative, even though it's in Italy's national interests to stay in the BRI, because if Italy loses special access to the Chinese market, it will be very bad for the Italian economy. The Italian economy has stopped growing, as we all know. It needs a new impetus for growth. And the new impetus for growth is not going to come from the US economy, it's going to come from the Chinese economy, because the new middle class, the large middle class that is going to buy Italian luxury products, is not going to come from the United States. It's going to come from China. So the Italians are, in a sense, sacrificing their own future by withdrawing from the BRI because of American pressure. But this is an example of how Europe has become geopolitically compliant to American wishes. In the long run, the Ukraine conflict will be seen as a sideshow. That's not a real contest. And in some ways, the United States is doing itself a disfavor by dragging out this Ukraine conflict. And I say the United States is dragging out the Ukraine conflict because without American support for Ukraine, the war wouldn't last as long as it has. And it is not going to be the fundamental mover of world history, but it's going to be a major distraction. This war could have been avoided. And all you have to do is watch the video of John Mearsheimer, which has now been watched 40 million times, over 40 million times. And you get a sense that in some ways, if the Europeans had been wiser and worked out ways and means of integrating Russia into not the European Union, but into the European community, create a common European house, as Gorbachev said, then this war could have been avoided. What this war shows more than anything else is the geopolitical incompetence of Europe. And yeah, it's a tragedy because if Europe had a more independent policy and found ways and means of accommodating Russian concerns without kowtowing to Russia, by the way. You don't have to kowtow to Russia, but you can give it the space and find a compromise solution on Ukraine. This war future historians will record that this war could have been avoided. But unfortunately, Europe no longer has the sort of strong, powerful leaders like Margaret Thatcher, like Francois Mitterrand, like Helmut Kohl, like Helmut Schmidt. No longer has that. And so that's why this war is dragging on. This is where the United States has got to realize that the world has become a much more intelligent and sophisticated place. So the kind of simple black and white distinctions that are made by American policymakers, democracy versus autocracy, it just doesn't work anymore. We are moving. The 21st century is going to be very different from any other century. It's a multi-civilizational, multipolar world where you need to understand all the shades of gray, all the nuances. And if you keep coming to this world with black and white perspectives, you'll be at a severe disadvantage. I think that's also why the Asian 21st century has done so well, because what it provides is a much more nuanced view of the world than anything that is provided in the American media or Western media. So there's hunger for someone to say, hey, the old Western perspectives are not going to help us understand this world. Psychologically, the rest of the world is preparing for the Asian century, while the Americans are still trying to preserve the American century. And that's going to create a fundamental disconnect between America and the world. The Americans don't pay attention to long-term trends. And I actually, again, as a friend of the United States, I'm saying, hey, this is a different world that's emerging. Instead of trying to protect American primacy, focus on improving the living conditions of the American people. In the long run, the choice for any US government, the fundamental strategic choice is, do you advance the interests of American primacy or do you advance the interests of American people, who, by the way, will suffer if there's climate change? So if you're interested in protecting American people, fight climate change first. Don't fight China. But only if primacy is your number one objective, then you fight China. These are the strategic decisions. I feel very sad that American law strategic thinkers are not bringing out these big fundamental dilemmas that America needs to address. Instead, everything is focused on short term, on the next election, on beating up China, with no discussion of the long-term issues. I think ASEAN is the most underrated regional organization in the whole world. It is the most underrated regional organization in the whole world because it is actually, in terms of deeds, the most successful regional organization in the whole world. Look at SAARC. It can't even meet. India and Pakistan cannot trade with each other. Look at the Gulf Cooperation Council. Saudi Arabia and UAE had sanctions on Qatar until recently. And look at European Union. It broke up before ASEAN did with Brexit. And, the European Union today has the biggest war on its doorstep in Ukraine. So if you compare ASEAN against any other regional organization, it has done a better job at promoting peace and prosperity in its region. And let me ask you, within the years 2010 and 2020, did the $17 trillion European Union contribute more to global economic growth, or did the $3 trillion ASEAN economy contribute more to global economic growth? The answer is ASEAN. So, ASEAN has done remarkable things. Now, what makes it difficult to understand ASEAN is that ASEAN is inherently a weak organization. It never has a clear long-term strategy. It always stumbles through. But guess what? It keeps stumbling through and moving forward in its own way, right? And it's actually quite amazing that, how much ASEAN has progressed, especially over the last 10 years. Again, in the year 2000, Japan's economy was 8 times the size of ASEAN's economy. Now it's only 1.5 times bigger. So look at that. Look at how much ASEAN has progressed. So I think ASEAN has developed its own, what I call, inner genius. And right now, for example, it's trying its best to maintain good relations with the United States and maintaining good relations with China, which is the right thing to do. And again, it does it quietly without too much fanfare, but it makes sure that both sides understand clearly where they stand. There's no doubt that the US government, I say this US government because it's either Trump administration or Biden administration, still wants to try and isolate China. But again, this is where there's no long-term strategic thinking. Only 12% of the population of the world lives in the West. 88% lives outside the West. And the majority of them, by the way, want to continue trading with China and want to continue dealing with China. And so, take Brazil, for example. 20 years ago, it took Brazil 1 year to export $1 billion to China. Now it takes Brazil 60 hours to export $1 billion to China. Look at that. And you're asking Brazil to isolate China? So, the Americans don't realize that in the Cold War, they successfully contained the Soviet Union. But today, they cannot contain China. It's a mission impossible. And, you talk of Quad and so on and so forth. Look at ASEAN, right? In the year 2000, US trade with ASEAN was $135 billion, and China's trade with ASEAN was only $40 billion. So US trade with ASEAN was more than 3 times China's trade with ASEAN in the year 2000. By 2022, US trade with ASEAN had grown significantly from $135 billion to $440 billion. But China's trade with ASEAN had grown from $40 billion to $975 billion. It's the world's largest trading relationship. It's bigger than the US-European Union trading relationship, right? It's an amazing. And so this idea that you can contain China is a mission impossible. Again, it reflects a lack of strategy. So, I think it's important for us, therefore, to tell Americans who visit us, please understand that the world has changed. And even if you go to Japan and South Korea, right? Again, let me ask you a simple question. Do Japan and South Korea trade more with the United States or trade more with China? You see, so you're asking Japan and South Korea. No, of course, Japan and South Korea will go along with symbolic moves and so on and so forth, right? But a far better approach for the United States to take is to acknowledge that they cannot stop China, and the best way is to try and still integrate China. And I'm glad you used the word rules-based order at the beginning of your question, because I think what Americans should do is go back and read a speech that Bill Clinton gave in Yale in 2003, which I also quote in Has China Won? He said, if America is going to be number one forever, then fine. America can keep on doing whatever he wants to do. It's number one forever. Bill Clinton added a but. He said, but if you can conceive of a world where America is no longer number one, then it's an American interest to strengthen multilateral rules, multilateral norms, multilateral processes, multilateral institutions. So if the Americans really believe in a rules-based order, this is what they should be doing, strengthening multi-rules and processes. Now, again, let me ask you, which country follows multilateral rules more carefully? Is it the United States or is it China? And as a former ambassador to the UN for over 10 years, I can tell you it is China that obeys multilateral rules. It is the United States of America that is strangling the World Trade Organization by blocking appointments to the appellate court. China is not blocking appointments. It is the United States that refuses to ratify the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. China has ratified the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. It is the United States that has withdrawn from the International Court of Justice and refuses to go back to the ICJ. So, I can go on with a long list. And actually, I think it is against American national interests to do this. So, as a friend of the United States, I say the United States should be the number one power embracing multilateral rules and norms, because at the end of the day, the United States as a society believes in the rule of law. So it should believe in the rule of law at home, and it should believe in the rule of law overseas. There's a long history of countries trying to stop China's technological development, and it has never succeeded. I'll give you a simple example. The Soviet Union thought that they could remain much stronger than China by depriving China of access to nuclear weapon technology. Guess what? Within a couple of years, the Chinese had it, right? So, China is now producing more STEM graduates, I suspect, than the rest of the world combined in some ways. The idea that you can stop China from becoming a scientific power is absurd. The Americans refuse to collaborate with China in the space program. Look at what China has done. Build its own space station. This is where the fundamental problem with people in the American administration is that they don't have a long-term mindset. They don't realize that the Chinese are looking to see where they're going to be, where the world is going to be 10 years, 20 years down the road. The Americans underestimate is the determination of the Chinese people. And the Americans also don't understand that when they carry out actions against Huawei, they're pouring salt into open Chinese wounds. And these open Chinese wounds come from the century of humiliation that China suffered from 1842 to 1949. And when you carry out actions like Huawei, they say, there goes the West. Once again, they want to beat up China. They want to slap China down. But this time, they cannot succeed. So, the national determination in China is absolutely amazing. And so, I wish that the Americans leaders who make a bigger effort to studying Chinese history, and by the way, I have a free edX course for them they can enroll in, and they will see that they got to step into the shoes of the Chinese leaders and understand that the Chinese cannot allow China to go backwards again. The Biden administration or the US government is using the old playbook against the Soviet Union and saying, we can use the same playbook that succeeded with the Soviet Union against China. Then they're getting it dead wrong. Because the Soviet Union, in many ways, had self-isolated. It didn't trade with the rest of the world. Its economy wasn't engaged with the rest of the world. And at the end of the day, what caused the collapse of the Soviet Union was not the access to advanced technology. It was the fact that their economy couldn't compete with the American economy. Just couldn't grow as fast. And was stagnant, couldn't produce the consumer goods and so on and so forth. And certainly could not manufacture more than the United States of America. Now let me ask you a simple question. Who has a larger manufacturing capability today? Is Is it the United States or is it the China? Now, let me ask you a second question. Who does more trade with the rest of the world? In the old days, clearly United States over the Soviet Union. Today is China over the United States of America. Then let me ask you a third question. Between the United States and Soviet Union, which country was willing to sign free trade agreements in the Cold War? It was the United States, not the Soviet Union. Today, it is China and not the United States. So these are amazing differences. And if there's one country that has studied the collapse of the Soviet Union more than any other country in the world, it is China. And what's the first lesson that the Chinese took from the collapse of the Soviet Union? Never close up your economy. Always engage with the rest of the world. And it's sort of bizarre that in some ways it is the United States that's behaving more like the Soviet Union, for example, by refusing to sign free trade agreements than China does. But having said that, let me emphasize that the United States still remains a formidable economic power, a formidable political power, a formidable intellectual power in terms of soft power and so on and so forth. So it'd be a huge mistake for China to underestimate the United States of America. Sadly, the India-China relationship today is also a deeply troubled relationship. And I do worry about it a lot because, as you know, Singapore and ASEAN, we are friends of India, and Singapore and ASEAN, we are also friends of China. And if you look back at the history of Southeast Asia over the past 2,000 years, the two countries that have had the biggest influence, or two civilizations rather, that have had the biggest influence on Southeast Asia are the Indian civilization and Chinese civilization. And paradoxically, even though China is geographically closer to Southeast Asia than India is, right? Despite that, the influence of Indic civilization is far greater on Southeast Asia. And if you go to Indonesia, for example, you see scenes from the Ramayana and Mahabharata played out every day all over Indonesia. So clearly, Southeast Asia and ASEAN have a lot to lose if relations between China and India become bad. So I think the ASEAN countries, therefore, should work harder at trying to improve ties between China and India, not to make them best friends, but just to create a new modus vivendi where they can live with each other despite the differences that they have with each other.